Everything you have ever been taught about death is incomplete. Not necessarily wrong, but woefully inadequate. We live in a culture that whispers about death only in the shadows, that avoids the topic with nervous laughter or changes the subject entirely. And yet, the truth is inescapable. Death is not an end. It is a process, a transition, and perhaps the most important moment of our existence. If we understood it better, we would live differently. We would love more freely, fear less, and embrace the unknown with the kind of wisdom that comes only when we stop running from the inevitable. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of a vast ocean, watching the waves roll in and out. You see the water rising onto the shore, touching the sand, then retreating again. No wave is ever truly lost. It simply changes form, merging back into the great body of water from which it came. This is death. It is not the annihilation of consciousness, but a return to something greater, something we have perhaps forgotten. The ancient Tibetan monks who wrote the Book of the Dead understood this deeply. They believed that the first moments after death were crucial, that awareness in those moments could mean the difference between liberation and being pulled back into another cycle of existence. Modern science, astonishingly, is beginning to confirm aspects of these ancient teachings. Neuroscientists have long debated what happens in the brain at the moment of death, but in recent years, studies have revealed something extraordinary. Research conducted at the University of Michigan observed a surge of brain activity in dying rats, a phenomenon that suggests heightened consciousness rather than a simple shutdown. Similarly, in 2022, doctors studying a terminally ill patient who suffered a fatal cardiac arrest recorded a burst of gamma wave activity, the very same brain waves associated with heightened perception and deep meditation just as the patient passed away. This aligns eerily with the Tibetan description of the clear light that appears immediately upon death, a state of pure awareness that few recognize before being pulled into illusions created by their own minds. The implications are profound. If consciousness does not simply flicker out like a dying candle, but instead intensifies, then what we experience in those first moments after death may be deeply influenced by the state of our mind at the time. This is why monks train for death their entire lives. They understand that the thoughts and emotions they cultivate in life do not disappear when the body dies. Instead, they shape the experience of what comes next. This is not just spiritual conjecture. The phenomenon of near-death experiences, NDEs, has been extensively studied by medical professionals, and the results are striking. Across cultures, individuals who have come close to death report similar experiences. A sense of floating above their bodies, seeing a brilliant light, encountering familiar but otherworldly presences. The consistency of these accounts suggests something more than hallucination. One of the most compelling studies on this subject was conducted by Dr. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. Over decades of research, he found that many people who had NDEs described a powerful life review, in which they relived not just their own actions, but also the emotions and experiences of those they had affected. They felt the joy they had given to others, but also the pain they had caused. This aligns perfectly with the teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which describes a phase in which the soul confronts a mirror of its own existence. There is no external judge, no divine being passing sentence. Instead, we judge ourselves based on the life we lived, and this self-reflection determines what happens next. Understanding this should change the way we live. If we know that every action, every choice, and every emotional state will be reflected back to us, then how we engage with the world matters more than we have ever been told. If kindness expands our consciousness and prepares us for the moment when we step beyond this world, then compassion is not just a moral virtue but a practical necessity. If fear and attachment create the very illusions that entrap the soul in cycles of suffering, then learning to let go is not just spiritual advice. It is a survival skill for the next existence. What does this mean for us now as we sit here, still breathing, still bound to this physical form? It means preparation is not something we do on our deathbed. It is something we do every single day. It means training our minds to be aware, to be present, to not cling to things that will inevitably pass. This is why meditation is not just an esoteric practice for monks but a scientifically supported method of rewiring the brain. Studies from Harvard Medical School have shown that long-term meditation strengthens areas of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, self-awareness, and compassion. This is precisely the kind of mental training that prepares a person to recognize the clear light at the moment of death rather than be swept away by fear and illusion. But meditation alone is not enough. We must also cultivate detachment, not the cold, indifferent kind, but the liberating kind. There is a reason why people who have had near-death experiences often return with a profound lack of fear about dying. They have seen firsthand that there is more beyond this physical existence. They realize that the things they clung to, wealth, status, grudges, trivial worries, mattered far less than they thought. If we can learn this lesson now, before we are forced to, we can live with a clarity that most people only achieve in their final moments. So I ask you this: if death is a mirror, what do you want to see reflected back at you? If consciousness continues beyond the body, what kind of consciousness do you want to carry forward? These are not abstract questions. They are the most important questions we will ever ask. And the answers are not found in religious dogma or philosophical speculation. They are found in the way you live, in the way you treat others, in the way you train your mind every single day. Do not wait for a crisis to force you into awareness. Do not wait until the final breath to wonder what comes next. The time to wake up is now. The time to live with intention, with kindness, with clarity is now. Because in the end, death does not change who we are. It only reveals us. There is a moment, one that ancient wisdom and modern science both point to, that defines everything. The moment when the body takes its final breath, when the heart ceases to beat, when the senses fade into silence. But what happens then? What do we see? What do we feel? What remains of us when the physical form we have identified with for so long is left behind? If the Tibetan Book of the Dead is correct, then this moment is not just the end of life but the beginning of a test most people fail not because they are weak but because they are unprepared. Science, too, has begun to confirm that consciousness does not simply blink out at death. Studies have shown that in the minutes following cardiac arrest, brain activity does not immediately cease. Instead, in some cases, there is a surge of organized electrical activity, a final burst of neural firing that suggests heightened perception. This aligns precisely with what ancient texts describe the appearance of the clear light, a brilliant radiance beyond comprehension, an opportunity for complete transcendence. Imagine for a moment that you are waking up from a dream, but instead of gradually returning to reality, you are catapulted into a realm of overwhelming clarity, a space without time, a presence so vast that your very sense of self begins to dissolve. Many who have had near-death experiences describe something eerily similar. A sudden awareness more vivid than anything they knew in life, a feeling of expansion, an encounter with light that is not just seen but felt as a profound intelligence, as pure knowing. The Tibetan texts tell us that this is the clear light of reality, and it is the first and greatest test. If we recognize it, if we surrender completely to it, we dissolve into its infinite awareness and escape the cycle of suffering. But almost no one does. Instead, conditioned by a lifetime of fear, by the habit of clinging to identity, by the terror of the unknown, the soul recoils. And the moment it hesitates, the illusions begin. This is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of what happens when the mind, untrained and unprepared, confronts a reality it does not understand. Modern neuroscience tells us that the brain is a prediction machine. It does not simply receive reality. It constructs it based on past experiences. This is why hallucinations occur, why the mind fills in gaps when faced with the unfamiliar, why people in sensory deprivation tanks start seeing things that are not there. If this is true in life, it is doubly true in death. The moment consciousness detaches from the body, it does not yet comprehend what is happening. It searches for meaning, for structure, for familiarity. And in doing so, it begins to project its own fears, its own desires, its own long-held beliefs onto the formless space around it. The Tibetan masters understood this long before neuroscience did. They warned that the first moments after death are a battle between awareness and illusion, between clarity and confusion. If the mind is untrained, if it is burdened by unresolved emotions, by attachments, by unfulfilled desires, it will create a world that traps it. It will see figures that feel familiar, voices that whisper in half-remembered tones, visions that reflect its deepest fears and longings. These are not external entities. They are projections, shadows cast by the mind itself. This is not so different from what happens to us in life. The illusions of death mirror the illusions of existence. How often do we see what we expect instead of what is real? How often do we react to the past instead of experiencing the present? Studies in cognitive psychology confirm that our perceptions are shaped more by our expectations than by reality itself. We filter the world through the lens of our beliefs, our fears, our conditioning. And if we do this in life, why would we expect death to be any different? This is why preparation is everything. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was not meant to be read to the dying but to the living, because it is in life that we train for the moment of death. It is here and now that we develop the awareness necessary to see through illusion. Meditation is not just a spiritual practice. It is a practical exercise in recognition. Studies have shown that long-term meditators have significantly different brain activity patterns, particularly in areas related to self-awareness and emotional regulation. When faced with the unknown, their brains do not react with the same panic response seen in others. They have trained themselves to remain present, to observe rather than react. And this, according to the ancient texts, is precisely what is needed to recognize the clear light at the moment of death. But awareness alone is not enough. We must also cultivate detachment, not as an escape from life but as a mastery of it. The great paradox is that the more we cling, the more we suffer. Neuroscientific research supports this as well. Studies on happiness and well-being consistently show that those who practice gratitude, those who release expectations, those who focus on the present moment rather than obsessing over control, experience greater peace and fulfillment. If this is true in life, it is even more crucial in death. Because when the moment comes, when the body releases its final breath, the state of our mind in that instant will shape everything that follows. Those who cling to their identity, their unfinished desires, their fears, will be drawn into the illusions of the Bardo. They will see familiar places, hear familiar voices, and without realizing it, they will follow them back into another cycle of existence, another birth, another forgetting. But those who have prepared, who have trained themselves in life to let go, will have a different experience. They will not react with fear. They will not grasp at shadows. They will see the clear light, recognize it for what it is, and dissolve into it. This is not just about what happens after we die. It is about how we live. The test of death is a reflection of the test of life. If we live in awareness, we will die in awareness. If we live in fear, we will die in fear. If we practice detachment now, we will be ready to let go when the time comes. And this is something we can begin today. It does not require a monastery or a lifetime of meditation. It requires a shift in perspective. Start by observing your mind. Notice when you react with fear, when you cling to certainty, when you resist change. Train yourself little by little to let go. Engage in practices that bring clarity. Meditation, mindfulness, deep reflection, whatever brings you into presence. Cultivate the ability to sit in stillness without distraction, without running from discomfort. Because the moment will come, for each of us, when we are faced with the greatest transition of all. And when that moment arrives, the question is not whether the clear light will appear. It will. The question is whether we will recognize it. There comes a point in the journey beyond death when reality itself seems to fracture. The illusions become more vivid, more convincing, and the awareness that one has left the body fades into the background. For most, this is where the path to liberation is lost, not because the opportunity is gone, but because the mind, conditioned by a lifetime of habits, begins constructing a new reality out of fear, attachment, and confusion. If death is a mirror of life, then the way we respond to challenges, emotions, and perceptions while alive is exactly how we will respond in the afterlife. This is why ancient wisdom and modern psychology both emphasize the importance of self-mastery, of recognizing illusion, and of understanding how the mind shapes experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes the stage as the realm of illusions, a phase where thoughts, fears, and desires manifest with overwhelming intensity. Science, surprisingly, offers a parallel understanding. Neuroscientists have long studied the way the brain processes reality, And one of the most startling findings is that much of what we experience is not reality itself, but a projection of the mind. Studies on hallucinations, sensory deprivation, and even dreams reveal that when the brain lacks external input, it generates its own world. This is precisely what happens in the Bardo. The external world of the body is gone, but the mind remains active, desperately trying to make sense of its new environment. And in that desperation, it clings to what it knows. Consider the research on patients who experience sensory deprivation for extended periods. When deprived of external stimuli, the mind does not remain blank. It begins to create sounds, images, even entire landscapes and beings. Some individuals in these studies report hearing voices, seeing faces, even reliving memories so vividly that they cannot distinguish them from reality. This is not unlike what happens in the Bardo. The soul, untrained in awareness, does not recognize that what it sees is its own projection. Instead, it reacts with either fear or attachment, and in doing so, it strengthens the illusion. This is why many near-death experiences contain deeply personal imagery. Some report seeing religious figures, others describe landscapes from their childhood, while some encounter terrifying entities that reflect their deepest fears. This is not evidence of an objective afterlife shaped by external forces. It is evidence of the mind doing what it has always done, creating reality based on belief, emotion, and expectation. If this is true, then what happens in the afterlife is not predetermined. It is shaped by the state of consciousness at the moment of death. If a person dies in fear, that fear will color their experience. If a person dies with a sense of peace and awareness, the illusions will hold less power. This is not just theory. Psychologists studying trauma have observed that people who have experienced severe emotional distress often relive it repeatedly, not because they choose to, but because the mind replays unresolved experiences. This is why veterans suffering from PTSD have flashbacks, why those who have experienced great loss often see their loved ones in dreams. The mind does not simply forget emotional intensity. It stores it, replays it, and if left unchecked, becomes consumed by it. The Tibetan texts describe this with chilling accuracy. They warn that in the Bardo, unresolved emotions take form. Guilt becomes a judge. Regret becomes a voice whispering accusations. Fear becomes monstrous figures pursuing the soul. And because these visions feel real, most souls react instinctively. They flee, they hide, they fight. But in doing so, they trap themselves further in the illusion. This is where the practice of awareness in life becomes essential. If we do not learn to observe our thoughts now, if we do not train ourselves to recognize when we are lost in mental projections, we will be powerless to do so in death. Modern mindfulness research supports this. Studies have shown that long-term meditation practitioners have significantly different responses to stress and fear. Their brains show reduced activity in the amygdala, the region associated with fear and reactivity, and increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thought and self-awareness. This is exactly what is needed in the Bardo. The ability to recognize when fear is arising. The ability to step back and observe rather than react. The ability to remain conscious in the face of overwhelming illusion. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a dream. Around you, people from your past appear. Some are comforting, others are terrifying. The environment shifts, the sky changes color, and you feel emotions so intense that they seem inescapable. But suddenly, you realize something. You are dreaming. The moment that realization occurs, everything changes. The fear dissipates. The illusions lose their grip. You understand that you do not need to run, you do not need to fight, you only need to see clearly. This is precisely what the Tibetan teachings describe, and it is exactly what lucid dreaming research confirms. Scientists studying lucid dreamers, people who can become aware that they are dreaming while inside the dream, have discovered that the moment awareness is activated, the brain undergoes changes similar to those seen in deep meditative states. Fear decreases, emotional regulation improves, and most importantly, the dreamer gains control over the experience. This is the skill we must cultivate for death. The ability to recognize illusion, to remain still in the face of chaos, to understand that what we see and feel is not necessarily real. But awareness is not something that can be switched on at the last moment. It must be practiced now, in daily life, in small ways that prepare the mind for the greater challenge ahead. When you feel anger, instead of reacting, observe it. When fear arises, instead of being consumed by it, notice how it moves through you. When desires pull you in different directions, instead of chasing them blindly, question them. Every moment you practice this, you are training for the Bardo. Every time you resist the urge to be overwhelmed by emotion, you are strengthening the very skill that will determine your fate beyond this life. The illusions of death are no different from the illusions of life. We live trapped in projections of our own making. We are ruled by thoughts that we do not question, beliefs that we do not examine, fears that we do not confront. And because we do not recognize them now, we will not recognize them then. But the choice is ours. We can choose awareness over reactivity. We can choose to see clearly rather than be deceived. And if we begin now, in this very moment, then when the final breath is taken and the mind enters its next phase, we will be ready. Ready to meet the illusions with clarity. Ready to see through the fear. Ready to wake up. There is a moment beyond the illusions, beyond the fears, beyond the shifting landscapes of the mind, when everything becomes still. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes this as the Great Mirror, a moment when the soul is forced to confront its entire existence not as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing reality. Every choice, every thought, every act of kindness or cruelty is no longer something abstract. It is experienced in full, not from the limited perspective of the self, but through the eyes of those it affected. This is not judgment in the way religious traditions have framed it. There is no external deity weighing sins and virtues. There is only the undeniable truth of one's own life, reflected back with absolute clarity. And it is here, in this moment, that the soul makes its most important realization. It is not being punished. It is not being rewarded. It is simply being shown itself. Modern science has found striking parallels to this idea. Near-death experience research, particularly the work of Dr. Bruce Grayson and Dr. Raymond Moody, has documented countless cases of people who, upon being resuscitated, describe a life review that matches the Tibetan texts almost exactly. They do not just see their lives flash before their eyes in a sequence of memories. They feel their lives. They experience their own actions from the perspective of others. If they caused pain, they feel that pain as if it were their own. If they brought joy, they experience that joy radiating back into them. The consistency of these reports across cultures, religions, and belief systems suggests something profound. It suggests that at the moment of death, consciousness does not dissolve but expands, reaching beyond the limits of the individual self into something far greater. But why does this happen? Neuroscientists studying consciousness have proposed that the brain operates as a filter, not a generator of awareness. The famous work of Dr. Carl Pribram and physicist David Bohm suggests that the mind functions holographically, meaning that memory and experience are not stored in isolated locations but are encoded throughout the brain and possibly even beyond it. This could explain why, at the threshold of death, people report a sudden expansion of awareness, emerging with something vast, as if the filter of the physical brain is lifted and all experiences become accessible at once. The implications are extraordinary. If the life review is not a hallucination but a fundamental part of the transition beyond death, then it means that how we live shapes what we will face. It means that nothing is forgotten. Every word spoken, every moment of kindness, every betrayal, every act of love becomes part of the fabric of our existence, and we will encounter it again in its rawest, truest form. Understanding this should change everything about how we live. If we know that at the end of this journey, we will not just recall our actions but feel them, then the way we treat others is not just a moral question, it is a practical one. If we want peace in death, we must create peace in life. If we want to be free of regret, we must live with intention. But here is where most people falter. They assume that they will deal with these things later, that forgiveness, self-reflection, and resolution can wait, that at some distant point in the future, they will make amends, they will change, they will finally become the person they always intended to be. But the Great Mirror does not wait. It does not ask whether you were planning to be kinder tomorrow. It only reflects who you are in this moment. Psychologists studying trauma and memory have found that the human brain is remarkably skilled at avoiding discomfort. We repress painful memories, justify our mistakes, and create narratives that allow us to live without constantly confronting our own shortcomings. But these coping mechanisms, while useful in the short term, do not erase the emotional imprints of our actions. Neuroscientific research into memory reconsolidation has shown that experiences, particularly those tied to strong emotions, are not merely stored but are relived neurologically when recalled. This means that unresolved emotions do not disappear. They remain embedded in us, waiting for a moment when they must be faced. And according to the Tibetan teachings, that moment is death itself. So what does this mean for us now, while we are still here, still breathing, still capable of shaping our fate? It means we cannot wait for the life review to reveal what we already know deep down. We must begin the process now. We must ask ourselves, if I were to face my life today in full clarity, would I be at peace with what I see? If not, then we must act. We must resolve what lingers in our hearts, whether it be the words we never spoke, the forgiveness we never granted, or the kindness we withheld out of fear or pride. This is not just philosophy. It is practical psychology. Studies on end-of-life patients have shown that those who engage in life reflection, who make peace with their past before the final moment arrives, experience significantly less fear and distress. Those who leave things unresolved, who push away thoughts of mortality until it is too late, often face deep emotional turmoil in their final days. The conclusion is clear. The way we live determines the way we die. And the way we die determines what comes next. There is a reason why spiritual masters throughout history have taught that death is not something to fear, but something to prepare for. Socrates, before drinking the poison that would end his life, spoke not of sorrow but of transition. The Buddha, in his final moments, reminded his disciples that everything is impermanent, and that awareness is the only refuge. These were not words of resignation, but of wisdom. They understood that the life review is not something that happens only after death. It is happening now in the quiet moments when we reflect on who we are. The great mirror does not appear only when the body ceases to function. It appears in every interaction, every relationship, every choice we make. If there is one thing to take away from this, it is this: do not wait. Do not assume that understanding will come later, that peace will arrive in its own time, that the past will somehow resolve itself. Engage with your life fully now. Ask the hard questions. Who have I hurt? Who have I loved fully? What have I left unsaid? What fears have kept me from living in alignment with what I know to be true? This is not about guilt. It is about liberation. The Tibetan texts do not speak of punishment or reward, only of truth. And the truth, when faced with clarity, is not something to fear. It is the very thing that sets us free. There is still time. While breath remains, while the heart beats, while awareness flickers in the vast expanse of consciousness, there is time. But it is not infinite. The great mirror will arrive for each of us. And when it does, may we meet it not with fear, not with regret, but with the quiet certainty that we have lived as fully, as kindly, as bravely as we were meant to. May we see our reflection and smile. There is a moment beyond the life review, beyond the illusions, beyond the trials of the Bardo, when the soul reaches the final threshold. This is the moment of decision, the crossroads between liberation and return, between waking up and falling back into the cycle of birth and forgetting. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes it as the ultimate test, not administered by any external judge but determined entirely by the state of the mind itself. What happens next is not fate. It is not divine decree. It is the natural unfolding of consciousness shaped by everything the soul has carried up to this point. And the truth, both astonishing and unsettling, is that most people fail this test not because they lack wisdom, but because they lack awareness of what is happening. Modern neuroscience has provided insights that parallel these ancient teachings. Studies on the dying brain show that in the final moments, the mind does not simply shut down. Instead, many patients who have been revived describe a profound shift in perception, a sense of expanding beyond time, of seeing multiple possibilities unfold simultaneously. This aligns closely with the Tibetan texts, which described the soul, now fully separated from the body, experiencing a moment of weightless clarity where it can see the vast expanse of existence before it. In these moments, familiar visions arise, not as hallucinations but as invitations. Loved ones appear, places from childhood shimmer into being. Long-forgotten desires call out with a warmth that is almost impossible to resist. But the monks who wrote the Tibetan Book of the Dead warned that these visions are not what they seem. They are the final trap. This is where the illusion becomes most seductive. The mind, conditioned by a lifetime of habits, sees what it wants to see, and what it wants most is comfort. If there was deep attachment to a particular life, to relationships left unfinished, to desires unfulfilled, the soul will be drawn toward them like iron to a magnet. It will reach out, forgetting the journey it has just undertaken, forgetting the tests it has faced, and in that moment of grasping, it will be pulled back into the cycle of reincarnation. Not because of punishment, but because of choice. The teachings suggest that rebirth happens the moment the soul latches onto an identity, a desire, or a fear. Modern psychology provides an eerie parallel. Studies on decision-making have shown that most human choices are made not through rational thought but through unconscious conditioning. We are drawn to the familiar, to what feels safe, to what confirms our deepest beliefs about ourselves. If this is true in life, why would it be different in death? But there is another path, a path few take, yet one that has been mapped for centuries by those who saw through the illusion. It requires something incredibly simple yet profoundly difficult: detachment. Not the kind of detachment that rejects life, but the kind that sees through it. The moment the soul recognizes the final visions as projections rather than reality, the illusion collapses. The loved ones calling it back dissolve like mist in the morning sun. The landscapes of childhood fade. The pull of reincarnation loses its grip. And what remains is something so vast, so luminous, that words cannot contain it. The Tibetan texts describe this as merging with the fundamental nature of reality, as stepping beyond the cycle of suffering, as the moment of true awakening. This is not just mystical speculation. Quantum physics has begun to suggest that the fundamental nature of reality may not be physical at all, but rather a field of consciousness that underlies everything. Researchers in consciousness studies, such as Dr. Stuart Hameroff and physicist Sir Roger Penrose, have proposed that the mind is not merely a byproduct of the brain but a fundamental part of the fabric of the universe itself. If this is true, then what the Tibetan masters described was not religion but physics before its time. The idea that consciousness can merge with something beyond individual existence is no longer just a spiritual concept. It is a scientific possibility. But the question remains: if this path is real, why do so few take it? Why do so many return rather than transcend? The answer is as unsettling as it is simple. Most people do not realize they have a choice. They follow their habits, their emotions, their conditioned responses, just as they did in life. If they were ruled by fear in life, they will be ruled by fear in death. If they clung to identity in life, they will cling to it in death. And in doing so, they will return. This is why preparation is not something that happens at the moment of dying. It must begin now, while we are still here, still conscious, still capable of shaping the mind that will determine our fate. If death is a test, then life is the preparation. Every moment of awareness, every practice of letting go, every act of seeing through illusion is training for that final moment. This is why monks spend their lives meditating, why spiritual seekers cultivate detachment, why those who study these teachings do not wait until the last breath to understand them. Because the habits of the mind do not change simply because the body dies. The way we react to life is the way we will react to death. So what can we do now? The first step is to recognize where we are still trapped. What are we most afraid to lose? What identities do we hold onto most tightly? What desires still pull us in directions we do not consciously choose? These are the things that will bind us in the end. The second step is to practice letting go while still living. This does not mean rejecting life, but engaging with it fully, without attachment. Love without possession. Experience without clinging. Move through the world as if it is a dream, because in the end, that is exactly what it will feel like. The third step is to cultivate awareness. Mindfulness is not just a relaxation technique. It is training for the most important moment of our existence. The more we practice seeing through illusion now, the more we will recognize it when it matters most. Meditation studies have shown that long-term practitioners have significantly different neural patterns, showing increased activity in regions associated with self-awareness and emotional stability. This is not a coincidence. It is preparation. And finally, the fourth step is acceptance. We must stop fearing death. If we live in fear of it, we will die in fear of it. If we refuse to think about it, we will be unprepared when it arrives. But if we make peace with it now, if we embrace it as a transition rather than an end, then when the moment comes, we will meet it with clarity, not confusion. In the end, the choice is simple. Awareness or illusion, fear or freedom, return or transcendence. Most will choose without realizing they are choosing. But some, the few who wake up in life, will wake up in death as well. And for them, the cycle ends. The journey is over. The great return begins.